Okay, today's guest is Preston Dennett, who began investigating UFOs and the paranormal in 1986 when he discovered that family, friends, and coworkers were having dramatic unexplained encounters. Since then, he has interviewed hundreds of witnesses and investigated a wide variety of paranormal phenomena. He is a field investigator for the Mutual UFO Network, MUFON, a ghost hunter, a paranormal researcher, and the author of over 30 books and more than 100 articles of UFOs and the paranormal. Several of his books have been on Amazon's UFO bestseller list, and his books have been translated into several languages. Welcome, Preston.
Hey, thanks for having me on the show. I appreciate it.
Yeah, as I've traveled my own particular journey through spirituality or of opening myself up to a higher level of consciousness with doing different types of work, I've come to the not the realization. I've come to the place in my life a few years ago, maybe, where I realized obviously there's more to what meets the eye in our universe, and having specific encounters myself made it interesting to show me certain things from the universe. And since then, doing my interviews, I've been fascinated with speaking to people like yourself who have the information, the insight, and the experience of, in this field itself. So maybe you could just share with the audience of how you got started in this work.
Yeah, sure. I got dragged into this kind of kicking and screaming, really. This was not something I was looking for. I did not believe in UFOs or really anything paranormal at all. Very skeptical. But it all changed on November 17, actually, 1986. I remember the day clearly. I was pretty young. I was 21 years old. And there was a report on the news about a sighting over Alaska by a commercial airliner. Now a really famous case. Uh, but back then on the news report, it was very brief, very tongue in cheek. They kind of just joked about this pilot who thought he saw a UFO. I later learned that it wasn't just the pilot, it was his whole crew. This was a very large object, larger than his commercial jet, which tracked the plane for over an hour. It was on radar. I mean, it was a great case, but it was just a very jokey news report. And it kind of made me tilt my head because they showed the pilot. I thought, this poor guy, he's throwing his career away by reporting something which could not possibly be true. And it ended up he was throwing his career away. But it interested me enough to ask my brother, because years earlier he had come running to the house, my brother Mark, my older brother, saying he'd saw a UFO. And I remember at the time, I'm just like, shut up. I don't want to hear it. I don't believe in such things. And now I don't know, I was just barely open-minded enough to hear what he had to say. He's like, oh man, yeah, I saw this metallic disc. It had
Yeah.
colored lights on it, a dome on top. It was silent. It was at treetop level. He chased it down the road, actually. This is in Southern California, in Reseda. And he says he kept it in view for about 15 minutes, past other cars who were also chasing it, hanging out the window, pointing at it. I'm like, wow, you're serious? And he's like, yeah. He says, my two friends were with me, Phil and Greg.
Wow.
Uh, and I knew them. He's like, if you want to talk to them, they'll talk to you. I'm like, sure. And so I ended up talking to them. They described the same thing. And that's kind of what got the ball rolling. And here's where it really, shocked me. Found out that I had other family members, two sister-in-laws who had had encounters. One had an encounter with gray type ETs. That was a huge shock. And I had friends who had really good encounters. One had missing time. And stupid me, I brought it up at work. I worked at the business office doing data entry mostly. And the lady whose desk was right next to mine said, oh yeah, me and my whole family, we watched this object stop, would hover, turn at right angles, it darted across the sky. And I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. And
Yeah,
then
yeah.
once, and it's another coworker, Dorothy, who's totally unfiltered, right? Just lays it out and says, oh, one followed us home from the library. And she described a really incredible encounter. So basically it just hit home. And that caused me to start buying books on this subject. I was going to disprove it. I was going to let him know it's swamp gas, uh, which of course turned out not to be true. These books described more evidence, a UFO cover up, and it just turned my world upside down. Um, I ended
Yeah.
up going out and looking for UFOs myself, and eventually did see some. But yeah, I started writing. I joined UFO groups. Eventually started going on the radio, and after about 10 years of research, I put up my first book and have never looked back.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's always somewhat of a disparity between people believing or not believing. It's almost a polarized mindset. Um, and you question so many different things, I believe, from religion to our existence, and people don't really want to go down that rabbit hole of understanding things. But I think, um, I mean, I know people myself that I've communicated with, had conversations with, who spoke to me and said, I never told anybody, but when I was younger, I saw this UFO in the street. Or an older gentleman during maybe the 40s and the 50s when he was a little kid, and he said he saw the Hindenburg fly over the day it exploded. But then when he got a little older, in terms of seeing this type of phenomena, he saw a UFO when he walked out of work up in the Catskills in New York. And it was just interesting for me to hear stories that people never shared with anyone, but finding someone that they felt would believe them and not look at them like they were crazy was, I think, an important concept, an important part to be able to do. Um, you've
Yeah.
written several books, but you're working on a specific. You have your most recent book. Maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. This most recent book is called Not From Here, Volume 4. It's part of a series, obviously, because I was writing a lot of articles, and these were not getting into the books. They were in magazines, which were very fleeting. A month goes by and another issue comes out. And I started like realizing a lot of my research was not available to the public. And I started putting them out in these series of books, which I think are really cool because what these articles do is sort of explore the lesser known patterns in UFO contact, some of the more bizarre outlying cases that don't fit the standard model of contact.
Right, right,
So, for example, I think in the first volume I talked about uh, UFOs over graveyards. I found a bunch of cases, and just kind of went on from there. UFOs that hover over rocket launches, bunch of cases. UFOs over prisons, of all things. Uh, Cases where people are taken on board and seeing alien animals, or cases where ETs are picking plants. And yeah, Volume 4 covers a wide variety of subjects of sort of just
yeah.
stuff that flies under the radar a little bit.
You mentioned the car lift case. Maybe you could just discuss that one. That seems very interesting.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot of cases out there in the literature where UFOs are chasing cars down the road. I mean, a lot of them. And I always wondered about it because I'm like, are these teenagers driving these craft, scaring the daylights out of people? Because it's a very sort of peculiar behavior. And there's so many cases like this. And people are like freaked out when the UFO drops down out of the sky and it's circling their car and following down the road for miles. But these cases go to a whole new level. And these are cases where the UFOs not only come down and will chase your car down the road, but actually lift it up off
Right,
the
right,
highway. And I remember the first case I got of that was during a wave of sightings over my hometown, which was Topanga Canyon, California. That was in 1992, June 14th. A couple was driving through the canyon, which is pretty rural and pretty steep with big canyons, walls. And a lot of people were having sightings that night, but they described this object. They called the police actually. It came down and was following their car. They became very nervous. And then it swooped down. They said it was about 50 feet over their car, a perfect disc. It shined a cone shaped light and pulled it up off the ground. And they had missing time. I think they probably were taken on board, but don't remember. They were set down, ended up calling not only the police, but going to the doctor. They were real shook up. And that was my first case. But when I started writing more books, I started running into more cases. And I think the one that really got me into it was a really bizarre case, which occurred in 1959. This is outside of Goldfield, Nevada, where three or perhaps four teenagers were driving along outside in the desert and got stuck in the sand of the desert there and couldn't get out. This was at night. And they're like, well, guess one of us is going to have to walk out in the morning. So they're just sitting there in the truck talking and actually mentioned UFOs, which may sound synchronistic, but doesn't surprise me because they're listening.
Right, right.
And one comes down and pulls their truck out of the sand and puts it back on the highway. So,
Wow, wow.
right? I mean, that's just wild. And I know how that must sound to a skeptic, but I've got case after case after case of this. I mean, it's crazy. There was one case which was really, I think, very interesting, which involved two racers, actually, um, who were driving through Argentina on a car race. They dropped out at some point due to car trouble, got their stuff fixed, and were driving back along this highway. This is in 1978. It's a very famous case in Argentina. But this object drops down and hovers over the car, lifts them up about 6 feet off the road, and carries them for 2 or 3 miles right over the
Wow,
road,
wow.
puts it back down. They weren't taken inside or anything. I mean, I don't know what exactly the motive is here other than to really show off. It's crazy because I got like 20 cases like this.
Interesting. Um, with regards to not only abductions but to encounters, are there specific people that have a greater chance of being not only abducted but having a sighting over other people? Is there a reason that the alien groups are looking for specific types of people to encounter or to take get their attention?
There are some patterns for sure. It can be very much random. If you're outside, that totally increases your chances. So we have a lot of kids, a lot of truck drivers, night watchmen, policemen. If you're driving on a remote highway, that's definitely increases your chances. But I studied my own files on this, and I've interviewed hundreds of people, and it's 100% even, 50-50 between men and women. It's people of all ages. It has nothing to do with blood type or ancestry or religion or education or really anything. But I
Right,
did find a few patterns. And this is particularly not really just sightings, because pretty much anybody can have a sighting. Uh, but if you're having close contact, there are huge patterns. And one is that if you have, like, say, are taken on board, the chances are really good that your parents were, or your aunts, or your uncles, or someone in your family. It does seem to track families. If you're an abductee or a contactee, rather, yeah, your kid will likely be one too. So this is a huge pattern. Also, another pattern I noticed is if you're displaying any level of psychic ability, because a lot of these contactees have a wide variety of paranormal events surrounding them. And they have things like out of body experiences or clairvoyance or past life recall or ability to heal, mediumship, psychic reading, Reiki, all of this stuff comes
yeah,
up
yeah.
quite a bit.
Very interesting. Yeah, I noticed last summer I was on the beach here in New Jersey, and I would say in the summertime, in the July sometime, uh, this came about maybe 500, 600 feet off the ground to the right of me, and I probably was the only one who saw the incident, or it looked
Wow.
like almost like a drone, but then it turned into something very silver and flat, and then just took off. And it was very interesting for me. And I know you mentioned there's a specific time where more sightings are seen throughout the year, and maybe you could talk about it. I think you mentioned July as being a specific month. Is there a reason for that? In,
Yeah, I always wondered about that because investigators have long known that the summer months are particularly a high spike of UFO activity. I think the main theory was always that, oh, people are outside, children are on vacation off school,
Right,
uh,
right,
and it's much warmer, so people can stay up later at night. Uh, but I started looking into it, and because I had a number of people tell me that they saw UFOs on July 4th, and I kind of just dismissed those cases, honestly, because I can't think of a worse day to see a UFO other than July 4th, because everyone's going to assume you saw firecrackers.
right, right, right,
I mean, I suppose April 1st would be just as bad, April Fool's Day.
right, right,
But some of these cases were clearly not fireworks. Uh, And I started to hear more, I started doing my research and kept coming up. I thought, you know what, let's dig a little deeper here. And what I did first was looked at the databases for MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network, which was, an organization I joined years ago, became a field investigator. It's
right.
the largest citizen UFO study group. But there's also NUFORC, the National UFO Reporting Center. And boy, did I get a shock when I found out that both of these organizations, which collect, about 10 reports daily, uh, July 4th is the number one most common day to see a UFO.
Wow.
Okay, I don't know. I'm still skeptical because there's people are not often the greatest witnesses, and they can see if fireworks, and perhaps this is my line of thinking, right?
Right, right, right,
It's got to be fireworks. This just can't be. This makes no sense. And so I literally, this we're talking 100 reports on that day, as opposed to like 10, right? And so you go through the years, and that's thousands and upon thousands of reports to wade through. And I did. I went through all
yeah,
of it. It took me a long time. And I found out that a lot of them probably were what we would call party lanterns, which are, sky lanterns, where you take a little candle and a paper bag type device.
right,
And they sell these things, and they rise up into the sky. They last about 15 minutes. But if you see one from some distance, because they can get like 4,000 feet high, they look like glowing balls of light, and you can see them from very far away. And if they're catching the breeze, they can appear to hover or dart or
right.
kind of move.
Yeah, yeah, right. With the wave of heat. I had an encounter also. I was driving on the parkway and maybe it was midwinter. Not an encounter, I would say. I saw a blue like Roman candle explode right over the car, which was like a blue flash, and it was maybe about 100 feet over my car. And so for me, it was fascinating. It was the same year that I saw the UFO, and then I had saw this light flash by. As I've watched Project Blue Book, which was interesting on the History Channel. I thought that was a very fascinating series. I don't know if it was completely accurate with Hynek and the other participants in the episodes that they portrayed, but seeing the different types of incidents that were investigated brought it to life of the reality of what took place. Um, I've interviewed other people. I've interviewed Angela Thompson Smith. She wrote a book, Voices of the Cosmos, and the different encounters of communicating with alien races and their message and what they're trying to uh, send to us or transport to us. I know during the Roswell years, when we were doing the nuclear testing, I know that from researching and hearing and speaking to people that that was when many of the sightings began to increase. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah.
Could you
There's, I mean,
explain why maybe?
we know as researchers that they've been around forever. We've got evidence of this going all the way back to prehistory, really. We've got reports in the ancient writings of India. They call them Vijnanas. We've got cave paintings of UFOs that are very much the classic saucer, and ETs for that matter. But hieroglyphs, pre-Columbian artifacts, it goes all through history. The Romans called them flying shields. In the Middle Ages, there's wood carvings, which clearly show objects in the sky with, full-on saucers and cylinders and so forth. Renaissance paintings. So we know they've been around forever, but what's happening now is unprecedented. There's never been this level of activity, and it all really began in 1947, pretty much precisely. And people have really wondered why. And the prevailing theory is that this is when we started exploding nuclear weapons. And that is when this huge super wave, is what I call it, swept across the United States and the world.
Right.
Very high levels of activity. And it hasn't stopped since then. There's been major waves every 5 years over big city centers. Or coming down over anything nuclear. This is absolutely a pattern uh, where they come over nuclear missile sites. There was a very famous case in Malmstrom, Montana, where they shut them down. Actually interviewed a witness firsthand. But anything, nuclear power stations, it's clear they're very much interested and concerned about our use of nuclear weapons. So I think that's the draw, which brought them in large numbers, because basically we're on the verge of destroying our planet. Uh, so I think that is what really brought them in such large numbers. And if you look at from a contactee's perspective, people are taken on board. They do get messages. Those who don't have a really strong fear reaction, and I mean, the first thing the ETs will tell you is, "Don't be afraid.
Right.
You will not be harmed. Have no fear. No harm will come to you." Some variation of that. But often people do get very scared, and they end up having missing time usually. But if you don't, if you're not scared, they will talk to you. And that's the message they give you: is stop exploding nuclear bombs. Quit messing around with nuclear material. You're on the verge of destroying yourselves and other areas that you're not even aware of. So apparently this bleeds through into other dimensions, is the message contactees are getting. So yeah, I think that's why we're still seeing UFO activity at high levels.
Do you think there would be that they would intervene if something were to take place, or they would allow free will to take over?
I'm a little bit on the fence with that, because I mean, they didn't intervene with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and we've had many nuclear accidents, Chernobyl and Fukushima, and
Right.
beyond that. Though I will say there's some UFO connection to a number of those cases. 3 Mile Island was a famous nuclear near meltdown.
Right.
And there were reports of UFOs over the plant following that incident, as well as Fukushima. I believe Chernobyl as well. I don't think we can count on them to intervene, but I've talked to contactees about this,
Right.
and some have asked specifically about, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Why didn't you intervene? And they said, well, we couldn't, because you need to know what happens when you do that. And others have said, yes, they absolutely have intervened, but the general public does not know about it. The governments do. Our
Right.
government
Right.
are very much aware of this.
So, what would be the point of them hovering around 3 Mile Island and supposedly maybe assisting in the, not the cleanup, but maybe assisting in the leakage of the radioactive material, or just scaring people, or being in the vicinity to show people that they're there um,
Yeah.
to warn people? Like, in other words, you'd question the reason for them being there, if it is free will and is in terms of us learning the lessons of what can take place. But I guess being in the background and saying we're here, we're taking notice, maybe is probably the real message that they're sending. And in terms of these times that we're experiencing now with the war in Europe uh, and things going on, many people are soothed by the fact that the aliens will intervene and keep us safe. Uh, not contradictory to what you're saying, but somewhere in the middle to what your belief is. Um, you,
I hope they would. I can
yeah,
only speculate, really. I don't know. I think you're probably right. It's just maybe they're studying it, see how severe it is. I don't know that they're directly intervening, but there is one case that kind of speaks to that, which is pretty well known, which was up in upstate New York, actually, the Indian Point nuclear power station.
right, right, okay.
That was, I think, during the Hudson Valley wave. There was an incident over that power station.
Was that in the 80s?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, that actually my friend who lived in that area is the one who told me that he had I didn't know about the it related to the nuclear incident there, but he told me that and I researched I saw that there was a wave of UFOs in that region in the Rockland County area of New York.
Oh
So
yeah,
maybe
huge.
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, but apparently what happened, this is investigated by Philip Imbrogno and others. UFOs appeared over the Indian Point power station and were hovering over one particular tower or reactor, and they investigated it and found out that it did have a flaw that needed repairing. So I'm wondering, again, I'm speculating here, if they were drawing attention to this so that people would investigate and help prevent disaster. Because that's pretty much what happened at Malmstrom. They
Sure.
shut down the intercontinental ballistic missiles for almost a day, and they could have, destroyed them. They could have taken them away. I mean, they could have taken heavy duty action, and they didn't. It was just clearly a message. And I personally investigated a case that really speaks to this sort of connection here, involving an electronics engineer by the name of Ray Sachs, who was on the USS Clamagore. And he had a very interesting encounter in 1971. The Clamagore was heading up the East Coast. This was at night. They were going about 12 knots on the surface of the ocean when a USO, an unidentified submersible object, came zooming up at 100 knots from the stern, far faster than anything we have that underwater.
Wow.
And it came right up next to the sub. And if you know anything about submarines and ships, you don't get approaching anything within a quarter of a mile. It's just too dangerous out at sea. And this thing came right up next to them. It was circular, and they couldn't tell how close it was because all they saw was a light. And the guy I interviewed, Ray, was in touch with the sonar room. That was his job. And the captain, the commander, says, what are the sonar guys seeing? And they didn't see anything. They
Right,
were
right.
not capturing this on sonar. But one by one, all the high ranking officers came up on deck to take a look at this thing because they wanted to see it. And Ray was up there with another petty officer, and it stayed there for 15 minutes, pacing their submarine, and then darted off in another direction at about 80 knots. And this part was really interesting, sort of just a quick end note. The second in command turns to the commander and says, "Sir, how would you like me to report this in the log?" And the commander says, "Officers who report incidents like this do not move up in rank." Pretty much a direct quote.
Wow, wow, wow.
Yeah, I've talked about this on the radio before, and a submariner called in, described a similar incident, and say, "Yeah, none of these get recorded, and no, we don't have anything that can move 100 knots." But I think this is a clear sign from the ETs saying, you're carrying nuclear tipped torpedoes. The Clamagore was. It was not known at the time, but it was. What are you doing? I think it's a clear message. I've got case after case like this.
Yeah, when you speak of encounters with or abductions, is there a specific alien race that is more prevalent doing this type of work, or the when you're interviewing the people who you're doing the research for, what how do they describe the aliens?
Yeah, they're almost exclusively, I mean, really, universally, they're humanoid. And you have a lot of variation beyond that, but pretty much always, a head, two arms, two legs, two eyes, nose, mouth, and so forth. And in my files, and I think this is matching up with other people who really focus on this area, which I have, it is grays, what we think of as grays, short uh, beings, about 3 to 5 feet tall, usually, though sometimes taller, 6, even 7 feet, but usually 3 to 5 feet, very large heads, no hair, very large, dark almond eyes, very small nose, just a slit for mouth, almost no ears, just little holes, usually wearing jumpsuits or very tight tight suits
Yeah.
and speaking telepathically, 3 to 4 fingers usually. And that is, I would say, 50%, 70% in my files are grays or some variation of it. They're not always like gray. It might be pink or chalk white or a little bluish even. But beyond that, I would say there's praying mantis type, which is strange to me because, like, we have the praying mantis insect,
Right, right, right.
uh, and people aren't you know, reporting giant ladybug ETs or potato bugs, or this is what they're reporting. So we're kind of stuck with these reports, but they described them as being anywhere from 6 to 9 feet tall, or even taller. I have 2 outlying cases, one from a Navy medic and one from a school teacher, good witnesses, reporting 15-foot tall praying mantis beings. And they both had a good way to measure this. One guy he's a Navy medic, he stood right next to them and he said, listen, I'm 6'2". This thing was more than twice my height. And the other lady was a school teacher who saw one outside of her home in O'Fallon, Illinois, and it walked right under a street lamp. And she said it almost reached the top of the street lamp, and she measured it. Yeah, 15 feet tall. So we have grays, praying mantis, and I'd say the next most common is just plain old human looking.
Yeah.
People
What?
call them Nordics, but I don't like that term because some are dark skinned. They're not all white or Nordic, so to speak, but generally described as very muscular, often really good looking, but often, with white skin and blue eyes, 6 foot tall, but not always. I talked to a guy, a Native American, who had an encounter where an object landed in front of him on the road. This is on the Idaho Panhandle, early morning, and stopped his car and outstepped one of these human-looking guys, very friendly, and he said he looked Middle Eastern to him, dark skin, dark eyes, dark hair, silver boots, a blue jumpsuit. And
Wow.
another guy in Southern California, he saw a group of human-looking ETs, and he described them as about 5 feet tall and Mesoamerican looking. So variation there. So they all look like twins. That comes
So,
up a lot.
so in other words, the outfit, what they were wearing, was the determining factor, or the specific look of the individuals.
The specific look. Almost always people will describe these things wearing jumpsuits of some kind or skin tight suits. If anything, some people feel like, oh, I don't know if they were wearing clothes at all. Pretty sure they are. It's just very tight, so it's hard to see. But
So if they're not here only for protecting or making us aware of the potential harm that nuclear disaster can cause us, what are their other intentions of being on the earthly plane?
oh yeah, I think we've got a pretty good handle on this actually, as researchers have, because the cases follow a pretty standard pattern. I mean, there are outliers for sure. One main agenda, particularly I'm talking about the grays here, though this does turn up in other humanoid cases, is collecting genetic material, particularly from humans, so
Well,
men and women, and creating what we would think of as hybrid babies. Boy, did I cringe when I first heard this. I'm like, what, half human, half alien babies? You got to be kidding me.
right.
But this was pretty firmly established by Bud Hopkins early on. And I had already had cases when he came out with his book Intruders, which basically presented enough cases to say that this is truly an agenda. And we see that a lot. And the reason is, and we've got this firsthand from the ETs telling contactees that their genetics have become damaged due to deliberate intervention, and gamma radiation from space travel,
Wow,
which
wow.
has caused them to basically lose the ability to reproduce. And so this is the same scenario. There are slight variations, but It comes up again and again. So that is absolutely a major agenda.
So, so creating hybrid children that have the alien genetics as well as human genetics, or
Yeah.
a mixture of both. And have they said that that has assisted the DNA and improved the DNA?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And the theory is that they are essentially human, the Greys. They have said this. We looked like you at one point. So they're not as alien. I almost don't like that word
Right, right,
because another major message contactees get is, we are you, you are us, we are one, we are no different. But they also have another major agenda, which is beyond warning people of nuclear proliferation, which is absolutely one, but warnings of all kind.
such as.
Yeah, so we get a lot of reports about ETs warning people about our violence, our warlike ways, our aggression. Also, pollution is a huge factor that they seem to be very much concerned about. Environmental destruction. Remember, you may recall there was a case in Rua, Zimbabwe, at Ariel Elementary School in 1994.
Right.
Hugely famous case
Yes.
where the UFOs landed next to the school, got out, ETs got out and gave kids some messages, and that was all about polluting our planet, and chopping down our forests, and abusing technology. And that's the same message adults are getting. So that is absolutely a major message. In fact, I talked to one lady in Maine. She talked to her full-grown hybrid son, and he gave her a bunch of information and said, you need to tell people to stop eating so much meat. It's not good for you, all the hormones you're putting in it. They told her, you need to tell people to stop putting out the greed and corruption you're putting out because you're on the verge of destroying your planet. They said Hurricane Katrina had just happened, was nothing compared to what's coming up, which turned out to be true. We have
Right,
a
right.
lot of hurricanes. They said if people should start disappearing from this planet, it's being done by us for the universal good. I thought that was interesting. I mean, they said a lot of interesting stuff. They said who you thought were angels was us. They said we have been manipulating, or I don't think that's the exact word, upgrading the DNA of humans for thousands of years since biblical times, and not only humans but plants and animals. And specifically, they told her dogs and cats. They
Wow.
upgraded their emotional intelligence to help them interact better with humans.
Well, they
Is
do
that,
say it's man's best friend, which is so true.
yeah, thought that was really interesting because we do have a really close relationship with
Yeah.
dogs and cats beyond almost any other animals. Horses certainly, but not to the level of dogs and cats. So yeah, that is absolutely another agenda. Another is to wake people up psychically. And I mentioned, how contactees are profoundly psychic. Often this is a result of their encounters. People have been told flat out, this is our gift to you for what you have, given to us, for, allowing us to interact with you.
So
So people
yeah.
who are contactees often report, having the ability to heal or mediumship or all kinds of stuff. In fact, in this latest book, Not From Here, Volume 4, I put a chapter focusing on one specific aspect of this because it blew me away. I couldn't believe it, which is physical levitation. And I read Whitley
Wow.
Strieber's books. Now,
That's interesting.
if you're at all involved in this field, you know who Whitley Strieber is. He wrote Communion, and a very well-known contactee who said he physically levitated following an encounter. I thought, wow, that's bizarre because that's exactly what Stephen Greer said, another high profile
Yeah.
UFO contactee and author and researcher. He had an encounter, and following his encounter, he spontaneously levitated twice. And I thought, oh my gosh, I know of another case. Jacques Vallée, a huge pioneer in this field, had a case involving doctor, a medical doctor from France, who was actually healed of two conditions: partial paralysis and an axe wound in his foot after being struck by a beam of light from a UFO.
Wow.
And in the weeks that followed, he levitated on at least two occasions. And so I found a bunch of cases. Bud Hopkins had cases. He's huge in this field. And
So they must have the ability to know who has the potential to then spread the word, or will have the contacts to then increase the awareness of the messages that they're sending through these individuals. Um, is that true?
yeah, yeah, I think a lot of people who are contactees do feel duty bound to talk about it. And many of them, it's another pattern I noticed, particularly when people who are getting healed. That was the subject of my first book, UFO healings, because I found 100 cases. And I think this speaks to, against the fear narrative that's often in the media, that this is a scary experience and it's bad for you and they're going to eat you for lunch and they're experimenting on
Right,
you.
right, right,
It's not true at all. The main purpose behind a lot of onboard experiences is healing, actually. This is another agenda. And people who are getting healed are often people. This was a really interesting pattern, because I kept interviewing people, and it's all over the map: men and women, young and old, all countries, all races, or all ancestries, I should say. We're just one race.
right.
But I found a lot of them were doctors, a lot of them were social workers, a lot of them were environmentalists, animal rights activists, inventors, teachers, people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity, police officers, entertainers, and musicians. It's amazing. Now, that's kind of a loose pattern, because a lot of people who are being healed are ones who are already having contact,
Right.
or and some are just straight up random. But absolutely, there's a pattern.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we speak about the common person in the professions that you just mentioned, but in terms of the political forum, of terms of people who are in power, who have the capacity to then have an encounter and spread the word. I mean, I've heard about presidents being privy to the information or having encounters themselves. I don't know if it was Truman or Eisenhower. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, that was another thing I actually focused on in the book. um, because there are some really high profile political leaders who have had contact. And I think we've all heard the story of Jimmy Carter seeing a UFO. President Jimmy Carter, actually before he was president, had a very close up sighting with 11 people in Georgia, I think it was. Um,
Yeah.
and he was very vocal about it. In fact, his mom says he talked about it all the time. And in one interview, he said, I wonder if that was a sign that, I was supposed to run, or, that this would be the right pathway for me. And President Reagan also had a sighting when he was governor. Eisenhower, who you mentioned, in 1954, disappeared from public view. This is in February of 1954. And there was an enormous amount of speculation that, he had gone off grid. And one newspaper said that he actually had a heart attack and died. They retracted it when reportedly he had had a, quote, dental emergency. But immediately following this sort of kerfuffle, uh, rumors started coming out that he had had a face-to-face meeting at Edwards Air Force Base in Southern California with ETs who had landed there, human-looking ETs. And more information continued to come out. And now it's a fairly well-documented incident with absolute, firsthand reports from all kinds of people.
Wow.
And supposedly what happened was Eisenhower was taken there along with all kinds of people who are leaders in business and science and religion and spirituality and so forth. and had a face-to-face meeting, and it was sort of a diplomatic meeting where the ETs came down and urged us to disclose, urged our governments to disclose the ET presence. And we said we didn't want to do that because it would cause upsets in business and religion and politics. And they said, you really need to do that. The people need to know. But we refused. They said, you absolutely need to stop exploding nuclear bombs. This is far too dangerous. You don't know what you're doing. You have to stop your nuclear program. And we refused to do that. And we wanted their technology. And they said, no, you are not spiritually advanced enough. And reportedly, Eisenhower was actually given a ride on one of these craft, and some of the variations of this story. But the ETs showed their ability to turn their craft invisible and really urged us to sort of start a campaign of
Wow.
spiritual advancement. And it was an impasse. It didn't work. And this was 1954, right? And what we see following this is a huge rise of onboard experiences, of direct contact, of waves of sightings, of UFOs landing next to schools like Ariel Elementary, but Westall High School in Australia, or Crestview Elementary School in Opelika, Florida, or Hillsdale College in Michigan. I could go on. I ended up writing a book about 100 schoolyard UFO cases. This is their other agenda, which is to announce their presence. It's a huge agenda. And that's really what was going on, I think, with the Hudson Valley UFO wave in the 80s, as well as the Gulf Breeze wave. But there's waves all across the world. France had a huge wave in 1954. Huge. I mean, it left that country absolutely convinced of the reality of this phenomenon. Their governments know. But Belgium had a wave. Mexico City had a wave in 1991. I mean, it just goes on and on. So that's absolutely another agenda. And yeah, lots of world leaders have seen UFOs.
Yeah,
Governors.
and yeah, you mentioned they say take me to your leader when they come. I wonder if they've. I mean, I would think that they'd have an idea of who the leader would be of this world, of this country per se. But in terms of the significance of them trying to make an impact on what takes place, I guess the place to go would be Washington. And I know there were a lot of sightings in the 50s. I wonder if recently, if there are, or there's a fear of going to that area.
um, in terms of Washington, D.C., yeah,
Yeah, Washington D.C. Yes.
there's actually some really interesting research done on that. It is a huge draw for UFOs. And there was a major encounter there in 1952, I believe, right over the Capitol.
Right. Right.
And it was photographed and it was on radar. And we sent our jets to intercept them. It could have very well landed on the White House lawn. It's sort of a cliche. Why don't they just land on the White House lawn? Well, they very nearly did. Certainly looks like they were trying to. And there's been a lot of sightings over this area. And I think it's a clear message. Again, sort of announcing their presence. And it's amazing if you look down the lists of how many state governors have seen UFOs. Hayden Burns of Florida had an encounter. John Gilligan of Ohio. This is like 1972. I think it was Hayden Burns, 73 for John Gilligan, and 74 for Reagan. And they just go from place to place to place. There was a Senator Taylor of Colorado, Senator Isabella King in Arizona, Governor Fife Symington of Arizona was a witness to the Phoenix Lights. He saw them and he didn't talk about it at first, but to his credit, he did go public. So yeah, we've had governors and senators and representatives and presidents who are seeing UFOs. And it's not just the US. The president of Brazil saw one, the president of Mexico,
Yeah.
president of Iran, I think it was. It just goes on from there. It's amazing. People always say, take me to your leader is a very cliche thing. Well, yes, they have contacted our leaders, and our governments have chosen to cover this up.
Yes.
And that is so disappointing. And frankly, it's not fair. And it's disingenuous for them to say there's no UFOs when they know full well there is.
Yeah, but yet you, the work you do, the good work that you do, and the people that are interested in the work that you do, and other people that are interested in this, have to go based upon their own navigation system, not using the government or the media per se as a means of truth or truth or untruth. So I think what you're doing is interesting as it relates to the revelations that you're speaking about. Have the have the alien races have they revealed any information about their presence being um, brought to the forefront in the news, and overriding the dialogue that has taken place through the suppression of information?
Yeah, contactees have asked, why don't you just, you know, make a full-on disclosure, because they could, but they haven't in a way that's made it absolutely 100% undeniable. In a way, they have.
Right.
Our governments are very effectively covering up the UFO presence. Well, I won't say very effectively because it's been a disaster. But yeah, I think that they're moving towards the point where they can do open official contact, but we're not quite there yet. We need to be more spiritually evolved. According to the contactees, there are several factors that are preventing that, and it's largely our warlike ways, our greed and corruption, our inability to elect world leaders who have our best interests in mind. And they don't. It's frankly demonstrable.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go beyond the UFO subject and see how our governments have lied about just about everything. I mean, they've sterilized segments of the population, disenfranchised segments. They've irradiated soldiers. They have fed people venereal disease, hallucinogenics. They're drugging people against their knowledge. Uh, this is not good. And this is not even the UFO subject. When it comes to UFOs, their record is heinous. They have lied from day one and been caught at it. Just recently, we had the congressional hearings, right, this year, and we have the Undersecretary of Defense Intelligence up there. There's Ronald Moultrie and what's the other guy's name, Daley. Uh, were asked flat out, have we ever shot at these objects? They both instantly said, no,
Yeah.
that's not true. We know that's not true, and it's demonstrable. In 1942, we shot 1,500 rounds of ammunition over an object that was hovering over Culver City in Los Angeles, California. And that's just one of many, many cases.
Yeah. I've had contact with a shaman from Ecuador, and I've heard different stories. I don't know if it's accurate or not. Maybe you can fill us in with your research. That there are other alien races that are in control of certain manipulation of certain forces that take place in the government.
I don't, yeah, I've looked into this. It's clear that they are among us. I mean, there's human looking ETs. It would make perfect sense that they would have, sort of entered into every level of society to a degree. But I think it's also clear that there's sort of a non-interference rule, very much like Star Trek, that it's up to us to solve our own problems. People have asked that, why don't you come down and heal everyone? Because I said, we can't. You have to solve your own problems. We can guide, we can educate, we can help to a limited degree. I don't know that they're running government. I think if they were, we'd be a lot better off. But I think that they have done their best to interface with governments across the planet, and our governments have not cooperated. And it's
Yeah.
our governments who are really causing the problems. Those We're the ones who are warring, not the ETs.
Right.
There are no cases of ETs coming down and beating people up, or hurting them, or killing large segments of population, or anything like that at all. In fact, when someone's taken on board, I have zero accounts of what I would call sadistic behavior, of them intentionally hurting people. It can be very scary. Absolutely. It can be very traumatic for people to have contact. But
Right.
most people who have regular contact will come around and say, "Oh, I finally understand now. They're not trying to hurt me. They're trying to wake me up." It's our governments who are the problem. I don't think ETs are infiltrating our governments and wreaking havoc.
Okay.
Our own world leaders, the one percenters, the cabal, call them what you want, the Illuminati. These are people who have stolen most of the world's wealth
Yeah.
and are lying about this subject. They have the ET technology, they have the bodies. They're trying to reverse engineer it and have done so to a certain degree. So it's a real bad problem that we're dealing with right now in terms of our own governments.
Where do you see this headed in terms of revealing as we move forward?
Well, I think disclosure is inevitable.
Yeah.
Uh, and the government has made steps towards disclosure. I don't think voluntarily. I
Right.
think really they had to, because we all know their cards. We know that they have firsthand knowledge of this. If they don't say, yes, UFOs are real, they will lose all credibility. They will lose all relevance. They will lose all control over the narrative. And that's the last thing they want. So they had to take steps towards disclosure. And the cover up, yeah, has been brutal and ongoing, but it leaks like a sieve. There are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of whistleblowers from very high levels of government, all the way to the top, right down through. I mean, we have the former defense minister of Canada, Paul Hellyer, saying that he had an encounter. He knows for sure they're real. He's talked to people who've been inside UFOs in government possession. He says there's multiple races interacting with our planet. He says they're friendly. Credit to him for stepping forward. I think at some point, a government on our planet, probably not US, probably not China or Russia or England or any of those, France, I would say probably maybe Chile or Mexico or Brazil, all who have been much more forthcoming than other governments and actually have official UFO studies and do say it's real.
Yeah.
Though none of them are being fully forthcoming. I think it will happen. It's inevitable. And at some point, I think if enough people accept this subject, we're gonna see UFOs flying around regularly. And they may come down in large numbers if we face an existential crisis. A number of contactees have said this, that they will come down and scoop people up.
Yeah. Well, you've written already 4 volumes of your work. Are you looking to do anything else regarding that?
Yeah, I have a fifth volume in the works. I think that'll probably be it for a while, but I have several books that I'm working on. I'm doing another one on ghosts because that's another thing people need to know. There is life after death,
Right.
on out-of-body experiences, because people need to develop their psychic abilities. The ETs so want us to. I'm going to write more books on people who've had very close contact because I think that's the most fascinating of all. And yeah, another volume of the Not From Here series with some very interesting stuff in there.
Would you like to leave the audience with any words on the subject?
Yeah, yeah, I understand you may be skeptical, but here's my challenge to anyone who doesn't believe is that ask your family, ask your friends, ask your coworkers. I think you'll get a shock. And people say, oh, it doesn't really affect me, this subject. Well, I've got news for you. It does. Because if we do have these craft, this free energy, and we do, this could solve the economic crisis, the environmental crisis, the energy crisis, all three of which are largely manufactured anyway. So
Yes.
this is a hugely important subject. We do not need to live in a world of divisiveness and division and war and pollution. We have the technology to solve all these problems if we would just allow love and compassion to guide our actions. So yes, this is a very important subject, and that would be sort of what I would hope people would take away from this subject.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for sharing your insight, your experience, your research, and your passion over the subject, because there are many people out there who have this passion and looking to confirm, not only through their own personal experience, but to hear other people tell stories and experiences that ring true to them and give insight into future possibilities, specifically about disclosure and the messages that um, universal forces and entities pass on to other people to help them evolve. So I want to thank you, Preston, for joining me today.
Hey, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it was very nice to have you. So thank you.